Before the sun climbed over the rooftops and before the morning noise began its familiar rise, Michael stood at his window with a heaviness he could not explain. He had always been the kind of man who pushed through life with determination, relying on routine, logic, and a belief that if he worked hard enough, everything would eventually make sense. But lately, even as his days were full and his schedule packed, something inside him felt strangely hollow. It was as if the world kept moving, but he remained still, watching his life unfold from a distance he could not bridge. He did not know when the numbness began. Perhaps it had grown silently, creeping into his heart in small pieces, each unnoticed until the weight of it finally slowed him. What he did know was that he felt unable to recognize God in anything anymore. Not in his work, not in his moments of rest, not in the prayers he half mumbled out of habit. It frightened him, though he never said it aloud. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass and watched the early light soften the street below. There had been a time when morning stirred something sacred within him, a sense of expectation, a whisper that the day ahead might carry God's voice if he only listened. But now as the sun rose, he felt nothing but the quiet ache of distance. He had prayed about it, or at least tried to, but every attempt seemed to dissolve into distraction. He wondered if God had grown tired of him, or if perhaps he had drifted just far enough that heaven no longer bothered to reach back. Still, something inside him stirred that morning, a faint desire, a plea he could barely articulate. He wanted to feel again. He wanted to know that God still visited him, even when he was too blind or too weary to see. And so, instead of rushing through breakfast or immersing himself in tasks as usual, he sat down at the small table by the window and let his thoughts settle. The familiar opening prayer he whispered each day came slower this time, shaped not by habit but by an honest longing for connection. As he spoke, he remembered the gospel reading someone had mentioned to him the day before. Jesus weeping over Jerusalem because they did not recognize the time of God's visitation. Those words lingered in him now, stinging gently, as if they were meant not just for ancient cities, but for modern, tired souls like his. The idea that Jesus could weep over missed grace unsettled him. It wasn't anger that moved Jesus to tears. It was sorrow, a sorrow born from love, not disappointment. Michael lifted his eyes again, imagining what it would mean for God to approach him in quiet, ordinary ways, only to find him distracted, enclosed within his own noise. Perhaps that was why he felt this emptiness, not because God had withdrawn, but because he had failed to pay attention. The thought made him straighten a little, as though a small crack had opened in the numbness around his heart. As the morning unfolded, he found himself moving more deliberately. Even the way he opened the door and stepped outside felt different, as if the world carried a tenderness he had forgotten. The air was crisp and cool, scented faintly with the hint of rain. He walked down the street, noticing the way light spilled over the pavement, the way leaves rustled overhead, the way a sparrow perched on a telephone wire and tilted its head as if studying him. These were ordinary things, everyday sights he had seen countless times. Yet today they pressed softly against his awareness, asking him to pause. It felt almost like a visitation, not dramatic or loud, but quiet, like the corners of his life were whispering a truth he had been too busy to hear. God had never stopped coming close. He took a slower route to work, passing by the small chapel he used to visit years ago. He paused at the steps, hand brushing absent-mindedly along the railing, unsure why his heart urged him to stop. He hadn't walked inside in a long time. It had always been easier to say he was too busy. That prayer came just as easily at home, that God did not need buildings to be present. All of that was true, yet part of him knew he had avoided this place because stepping inside meant acknowledging something deeper. His longing, his weariness, his drift. After a moment of hesitation, he stepped inside. The chapel was dim, lit only by the candles flickering near the altar. It was quiet enough that he could hear the faint hum of silence pressing gently around him. He sat in the back pew and lowered his head, unsure what to say or whether he even wanted to speak. But he didn't have to. The quiet itself became a kind of prayer. He breathed slowly, letting the stillness soften him in places he had allowed to harden. And in that gentle quiet, he sensed something he had not felt in months. Presence. Not overwhelming, not intense, but steady, as though God had simply been waiting for him to lift his eyes. He whispered a small prayer, nothing ornate or poetic, just 7 words that rose from the center of his exhaustion. Lord, help me recognize you today. The words trembled slightly, not from fear but from honesty. It felt like opening a door he had kept shut for far too long. He remained there for several minutes, letting the prayer settle, letting his soul breathe. When he left the chapel, something in him felt lighter, though he didn't know why. He didn't receive a revelation. No voice echoed. No sudden surge of emotion overtook him. He simply felt a quiet awareness returning, a sense that God might truly walk beside him today, gently, patiently, without pressure or demand. And perhaps that was enough. As he walked toward the office, the city moved around him with its usual urgency. Cars rumbled down the street, shops opened, people hurried past with coffee cups and phones pressed to their ears. Yet Michael found himself watching them differently, not as strangers to ignore, but as people carrying burdens he could not see. People God loved, people who might also be missing their own moments of visitation. The realization humbled him. He felt not superior to them, but connected, as though they were all journeying through a world full of grace that so many of them, including him, had forgotten how to notice. By the time he reached his office building, Michael understood something he had never considered before. Recognizing God was less about straining for signs and more about softening the heart. And that softening, he realized, had begun. He stepped into the building not with certainty, but with hope, a quiet hope that maybe today would be different. The rest of Michael's morning unfolded quietly, yet everything seemed touched by a subtle shift he could not fully explain. He moved through the office with a gentleness that surprised even himself, noticing details he had ignored for months. The soft murmur of coworkers greeting each other, the way sunlight stretched across the floor, illuminating the dust in the air like golden threads, the faint sound of laughter drifting from down the hall. At any other time, he would have passed by these things without a second thought, absorbed in his responsibilities. But now something within him urged him to slow down and pay attention, as though each small moment carried a meaning beyond itself. When he reached his desk, he paused before sitting, letting his hand rest on the back of his chair. It felt strange to be this aware of something so ordinary. He exhaled slowly, realizing that awareness was not the same as emotion. He still did not feel a sudden surge of devotion or joy, but the numbness had a crack in it now, and through that crack, light was beginning to slip in. As he began answering emails and organizing his assignments, his thoughts drifted back to the chapel, the quiet stillness, the flicker of candles, the simple prayer that had risen from his heart. Lord, help me recognize you today. He didn't expect an immediate answer, yet he found himself watching the world through a different lens. There was a sense of expectancy within him, not like waiting for something miraculous to happen, but like waiting to hear a whisper carried on the wind. Late in the morning, a coworker named Daniel approached him with a weary expression. Daniel had always been friendly, though Michael had rarely taken the time to speak more than necessary. Today, however, he noticed the heaviness in the man's eyes before Daniel even opened his mouth. "Hey," Daniel said quietly, clearing his throat. "Could you help me look over this report before the meeting? I'm having a hard time concentrating today." Michael nodded. "Of course, are you all right?" The question surprised Daniel, who blinked and hesitated before answering. "Not really," he admitted. "My mother's been in the hospital. It's been a lot." Michael's chest tightened, not with emotion but with understanding. He knew that ache all too well, the feeling of drifting through a busy world while carrying a private storm. He gestured for Daniel to sit, and as he reviewed the report with him, He felt something stir within him again. This, too, felt like a visitation, not dramatic or mystical, but a chance to extend compassion where it was needed. He listened carefully, offered thoughtful suggestions, and made sure Daniel knew he didn't have to carry everything alone. When Daniel left, he murmured a quiet "thank you," and Michael watched him walk away with a sense of humility. It struck him that God visited not only through spiritual moments, but through people who needed kindness, people who crossed his path for reasons he might never fully understand. Recognizing God's presence was less about feeling something spiritual and more about responding with love in the small spaces of daily life. Throughout the afternoon, Michael continued working with a steady rhythm, but his mind wandered back to the idea of missed grace. How many times had he brushed off someone's need because he was too busy? How often had he hurried through moments that could have softened his heart? The thoughts didn't condemn him, but they invited him toward a gentler, brighter way of being. And as he considered this, he realized something else. Perhaps God visited not just in moments of need, but in moments of beauty too. On his lunch break, instead of eating at his desk, he walked to the small park across the street. It was a simple place, just a few benches, some trees, and a fountain in the center. Yet as he sat down beneath the shade of a tall oak, he noticed the play of light on the water, the movement of children chasing each other near the fountain, the soft rustle of leaves swaying overhead. Everything felt vibrant, alive, honest. Michael closed his eyes and inhaled slowly. He could almost feel the world exhale around him. For the first time in a long while, he allowed silence to settle over him without trying to fill it. He didn't pray with words. He simply sat with God as one sits with someone they trust, without needing to explain anything. The silence felt less like emptiness now and more like presence, a quiet companionship that wrapped around the edges of his heart. When he returned to the office, the day moved forward with gentle steadiness. He found himself smiling more, speaking more softly, moving with intention. He still felt the lingering dullness inside him, but it no longer defined him. It was simply a place being slowly restored, gently awakened, patiently healed. As evening approached, Michael gathered his things and stepped outside to the fading light. The sky was painted in hues of gold and rose, and for a moment he paused on the sidewalk, letting the beauty of it sink into him. He felt a strange mix of gratitude and longing, as though the sky itself was calling him forward into something deeper. Instead of heading straight home, he found himself walking toward the chapel again. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps he wanted to end the day where it had begun, with quiet, with stillness, with God. The chapel door creaked softly as he pushed it open, and once again the dim space welcomed him. This time Michael walked farther inside, sitting closer to the front. The candles flickered gently, casting warm glows across the statues and wooden pews. He bowed his head and let the silence settle over him, deeper than before. And as he sat there, the events of the day passed through his mind. Daniel's tired eyes, the children in the park, the way sunlight had danced through his office window. None of these things had been dramatic, yet they had felt like little reminders, gentle nudges from a God who was closer than Michael had realized. He whispered again, though not out of desperation now, but out of gratitude. "Thank you for today." It was all he said, yet it held everything he felt. The numbness was not gone, but it had softened. The distance was not fully bridged, but a path had begun to form. And he knew that recognizing God would take time, not because God was far away, but because learning to see required patience and humility. As he rose to leave, he felt a warmth settle in his chest. Not a surge of emotion, not a sudden revelation, but something quieter. A peace rooted in truth, a peace born from obedience, a peace that came from turning toward God instead of away. He stepped outside and walked home beneath the evening sky, aware now that each step he took, whether heavy or light, was not taken alone. The next morning greeted Michael with a soft gray light that filtered gently through his curtains as though the world itself were waking slowly, reluctant to break the quiet peace of dawn. He lay still for a moment, listening to the muted hum of the early hour, the distant sound of traffic beginning to stir, a bird calling faintly from a tree outside, the low rustle of wind brushing against the building. There was no dramatic transformation inside his heart, no sudden blaze of spiritual fire, yet he felt a quiet steadiness settling into him, like a foundation being rebuilt one small stone at a time. As he rose and prepared for the day, he found himself whispering a simple prayer he had not planned. "Help me see you again today." It was not a plea of desperation anymore, but a request born from trust. After the previous day's small but meaningful glimpses of grace, he sensed that God's presence was something that unfolded gradually, like dawn slowly overtaking the night. You didn't force it, you welcomed it. The walk to work felt different this time. The air was cool but gentle, and each step seemed to bring him more fully into the day. He noticed the elderly woman tending the flowers outside her apartment building, gently pruning the leaves with a care that spoke of devotion. He offered her a small nod, and she returned it with a warm, wrinkled smile that lit up her tired eyes. He noticed the child tugging impatiently at his father's hand as they hurried toward the school, and how the father, despite his rushed movements, paused long enough to kneel and tie the child's shoelace with tenderness. He noticed the way sunlight spilled across the tops of cars, creating a shimmer that almost made the world feel holy. None of these moments were extraordinary, yet together they formed a quiet mosaic that changed the way he moved through the world. It was as though the awareness he had asked God for was awakening slowly inside him, guiding his attention toward the places where grace hid in plain sight. When he reached work, he was surprised to find the office unusually quiet. A few people were gathered near the break room, speaking in low whispers. Michael approached, sensing tension in the air. As he drew near, he recognized Daniel standing among them, worry etched deeply into his expression. "What's going on?" Michael asked gently. Daniel turned toward him, eyes red and tired. "My mom took a turn last night," he said. "The doctors aren't sure what will happen." For a moment, no one spoke. The heaviness settled over the group like a cloud. Michael felt a familiar ache rise in him, yet instead of shrinking back, he took a small step closer. "Do you need someone to go with you?" he asked softly. Daniel hesitated, clearly overwhelmed, then gave a small shake of his head. "I'll manage," he whispered, though his voice trembled. Michael placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "I'll pray for her," he said with sincerity. "And for you." The words weren't dramatic, and he didn't expect them to solve anything. But the gratitude in Daniel's eyes told him that, in moments of fear, even the smallest expressions of compassion mattered. As Daniel left the office to head back to the hospital, Michael returned to his desk with a heaviness in his heart that was strangely connected to hope. It occurred to him that sometimes recognizing God had nothing to do with experiencing joy. Sometimes it was about letting your heart break open for someone else, trusting that God was present in the tenderness that suffering brings to the surface. As the day went on, Michael worked with a quiet focus, but every so often his mind drifted to Daniel and his mother. He whispered small prayers under his breath, not elaborate ones, but simple, honest words. "Lord, give them strength. Lord, be with them. Lord, let them feel you there." The hours passed more slowly than usual, and when lunchtime arrived, he stepped outside partly just to breathe. The sky was overcast now, the soft morning glow replaced by a pale, muted gray that matched the solemn tone of the day. He walked toward the park again, drawn by a need for silence and stillness. As he sat on the bench beneath the same oak tree, a memory surfaced, unexpected, unwelcome, yet strangely illuminating. He remembered the days after his father had died, when the world had felt heavy and indistinct, when every sound seemed muted and every step felt sluggish. What he remembered most vividly wasn't the pain, but the stillness, the strange quiet that came from knowing nothing could be fixed or changed, only carried. And in that stillness, without realizing it at the time, he had felt held, Not in a dramatic, miraculous way, but in the quiet endurance that had allowed him to keep moving. Even then, God had been visiting him, though he had been too numb to see it. As he sat with the memory, he realized something else. Grief had not made him weaker. It had made him softer, more aware of the fragility that every person carried, more attuned to the invisible battles woven into the everyday. Perhaps that was why his heart had responded so quickly to Daniel's pain. Perhaps that was why he felt compelled to pray more than before. Suffering had not pushed God away. It had created space for compassion, a space God willingly inhabited. A soft breeze drifted through the park, rustling the leaves overhead. Michael closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. The air felt cool against his skin, and for a moment, everything stilled. The noise, the worry, the weight he carried. He didn't hear a voice or feel a sudden surge of clarity, but he sensed something gentle and real. Peace, not the kind that erased fear, but the kind that sat with it. The kind that whispered, "You don't face any of this alone." By the time he returned to work, the sky had darkened, hinting at rain. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, and as the workday came to an end, he checked his phone instinctively. A message from Daniel waited for him. "She's stable, thank you for your prayers." Michael exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and gratitude washing through him. He typed back a simple reply, offering continued prayers and support. As he pocketed his phone, he felt the day settle into him with a meaning that stretched beyond anything he could articulate. He didn't feel triumphant or deeply spiritual, but he felt connected to Daniel, to the small acts of kindness he had offered, to the quiet sense that God had walked beside him through every hour. On his way home, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and sparse at first, then gradually heavier. Michael didn't hurry. Instead, he walked at a steady pace, letting the rain cool his skin and wash lightly over him. Each drop felt like a quiet gift, a reminder that life was rarely perfect, but always sacred. The world shimmered beneath the streetlights, and he found himself whispering again, though this time the words were simpler, clearer, shaped by everything he had seen and carried. "I see you." He didn't mean he saw God with his eyes. He meant he saw him in the ordinary, in the fragile, in the unexpected, in the faces of people who crossed his path. And for the first time in a long while, the recognition brought with it a warmth that spread through his chest, subtle but steady. When he reached home, he paused at the door before going inside, letting the rain continue to fall around him. He wasn't fully healed. He wasn't suddenly overflowing with emotion, but he was no longer numb. He was waking up, slowly, tenderly, faithfully. And he knew without needing anything more that God had visited him again. That night when Michael returned home and slipped out of his damp jacket, the house felt quieter than usual. Not empty, just quiet in a way that invited him to breathe a little deeper. The rain outside had softened into a steady rhythm, tapping gently against the windows like a slow heartbeat. He turned off the lights in the living room and let the soft glow of a single lamp guide him through the space. There was something comforting in the dimness, something grounding in the hush that seemed to settle over everything. He prepared a simple meal and sat at the table without turning on the television or filling the silence with noise. Instead, he let the quiet stretch naturally around him. As he ate, he found himself thinking about the mother from 2 Maccabees, the one who watched her son suffer yet remained rooted in unwavering trust. He had always admired her strength from a distance, but now her story felt closer, as though her courage illuminated something deeper about what trust looked like. She had recognized God even in her darkest hour. Even when hope seemed impossible, she believed he had not abandoned her. Michael wondered what it would be like to trust with such certainty, to see God not just in blessings or answered prayers, but in struggle, in uncertainty, in the long, unanswered moments that stretched like bridges between one day and the next. Perhaps faith wasn't always a matter of feeling God's presence, but of choosing to believe he was there, even when the world felt heavy. Maybe that was what recognition truly looked like. Not catching every sign, but knowing deep in your bones that you were never unseen. After dinner, he made himself a warm drink and walked to the small armchair near the window. The rain had softened again to a thin mist, blurring the reflections of street lights into gentle halos. He watched as the occasional car passed, sending ripples of light across the wet pavement. Everything seemed slowed down, softened by the night. It felt like the kind of moment God often used. Not loud, not dramatic, but softly persistent. As he sipped the drink, he thought about how the past few days had unfolded. None of the moments had been miraculous. Nothing had happened that would make a person gasp or fall to their knees. But there had been a shift, subtle, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking closely. In the quiet smile of the elderly woman tending her flowers, in the tenderness of a father tying his child's shoe, in Daniel's tear-filled eyes and in the fragile hope that returned when his mother stabilized, in the small prayers whispered under his breath, in the way his heart responded not with numbness, but with presence. It struck him then. Perhaps God's visits were most frequent when they were least obvious. Perhaps his presence wasn't meant to overwhelm, but to soften, to awaken compassion, to stir humility, to draw a soul into awareness, one gentle moment at a time. Recognizing God wasn't about witnessing miracles. It was about listening for the quiet invitations woven into daily life. He leaned back in the chair, letting the warmth of the cup rest against his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of belonging, not to a place or a routine, but to God himself. It was as though the scattered pieces of his spirit had begun fitting back together, forming something steadier, something rooted. He didn't need answers anymore. He didn't need signs. What he needed was this: the awareness that God had never stopped coming close. The rain thickened suddenly, tapping harder against the glass. Michael watched it fall in sweeping lines, illuminated by the glow of the streetlight. A memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought of in years. He remembered being a child, huddled inside during storms, frightened by the thunder that shook the walls. He remembered running to his mother, who would wrap him in a blanket and whisper, "Storms can be loud, but they can't reach the place where God holds you." Her voice had been gentle, her eyes steady, and even as a child, he had believed her completely. Sitting there now, he understood the deeper truth in her words. Storms, external or internal, could shake everything except the center where God held him. Fear could stir, but it could not uproot the presence that lived quietly beneath the noise. Loneliness could whisper, but it could not erase the one who remained beside him. He closed his eyes and breathed slowly. The sound of the rain became a kind of prayer in itself, steady, rhythmic, almost soothing. He imagined God sitting beside him, not saying anything, simply being there. It wasn't a vision, not even an emotion, but an impression, subtle, yet undeniably real. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael didn't feel alone. Later, he stood and moved to the small shelf where he kept a few belongings that held meaning. A photograph of his parents, a faded bookmark from his childhood Bible, a small wooden cross he had once carried during difficult seasons. He picked up the cross and held it in his hands. It was smooth from years of being touched, edges softened by time. He traced the lines of it slowly, letting the symbol sink deeper into him. Without planning to, he whispered, "Help me live today like you're really here." The words lingered in the quiet room, simple yet profound. He didn't expect an answer, but he felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a warmth that felt like a reply, not spoken, but present. He returned to the window, watching as the rain began to thin, breaking apart into scattered drops. The world outside shimmered under the streetlights, glistening like something freshly washed. And as he gazed out, he realized something he hadn't articulated before. God's visitation was not a rare event. It wasn't reserved for the holy, the strong, or the unbroken. It was constant, unceasing, patient, tender. God visited through people, through silence, through memories, through moments that passed so quickly you almost missed them unless your heart was awake enough to see. The day's heaviness eased into something gentler, something almost like gratitude. He thought about tomorrow, not with dread, but with cautious hope. Whatever it held, he knew now he wouldn't walk through it alone. Maybe the awareness he had asked God for was the very thing God had been giving all along, even when he didn't notice. He turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness. As he lay in bed, the rain quieted to a faint whisper. His heart felt calm in a way he wasn't used to, steady and anchored. He breathed out slowly, letting the last of the day slip away. For the first time in a long time, he welcomed sleep not as an escape, but as rest. And just before drifting off, he whispered one more prayer. Not of fear, not of desperation, but of recognition. Thank you for visiting me today. It was enough. If this story touched something in your heart today, I invite you to stay connected on this journey of faith. Please like this video to help it reach others who may need this peace. Share it with someone you love. Subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a moment of prayer and reflection with us. And let me know in the comments what part of the story spoke to you the most. Your voice matters here, and we pray for each other.